The morning sky above Berlin is steel grey, frozen and thin. It is March 6, 1944. At Tempelhof, air raid sirens rise through the cold mist. German civilians look up. A silver swarm is forming over the horizon. B-17s, hundreds of them, pushing across the capital for the first time. On radar screens, operators trace the faint arcs moving deeper inland. They have seen this before. Bombers from England, turning back near Hanover or Magdeburg. But this time, the formation doesn't break. It keeps coming. Then the disbelief begins. High above the bomber stream, smaller shapes appear, sleek, fast, single-engined aircraft. Mustangs. The same fighters that had been confined to France or the Low Countries, now gliding in formation over the German heartland. Luftwaffe pilots scramble in panic. Some laugh bitterly, convinced the reports are wrong. But when the engines roar overhead, reality sets in. The unthinkable has happened. American escort fighters have reached Berlin, and they're waiting for the defenders before the bombers even arrive. The air war over Europe has entered a new, merciless chapter, one that will break the Luftwaffe for good. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had become a test of endurance the Allies were losing. The US 8th Air Force, flying out of England, was bleeding itself dry in daylight raids against the industrial core of Nazi Germany. The concept was sound, precision bombing by day, with the RAF hammering cities by night, but the execution was murderous. Every mission deeper than the Ruhr turned into a slaughter. The B-17s and B-24s were brave, resilient machines, but without fighter escort beyond 300-400 miles, they were easy prey. The Luftwaffe's twin-engine fighters, Bf-110s armed with rockets, FW-190s with 20mm cannons, tore into the formations, climbing through the contrails, splitting wings and fuel tanks with a few bursts. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force's raid on Schweinfurt-Regensburg cost 60 bombers in one day, more than 600 airmen missing or dead. For every crew that went down, 10 more began to question if the daylight strategy could survive. Commanders debated halting the offensive entirely. At this rate, the Germans could win the air war simply by waiting. However, a quiet revolution was taking shape. In North American Aviation's plant in Inglewood, California, engineers had been working on a fighter first requested by the British, the P-51 Mustang. Originally powered by the Allison engine, it was agile at low altitude but useless above 15,000 feet. Then came the British idea that changed everything. Fit it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant used in the Spitfire Mk9. The transformation was immediate. The Mustang's ceiling and range soared. Combined with external drop tanks, it could now escort bombers far beyond what was once possible. It was faster than the German Bf-109 and could fight effectively at high altitude, the domain where the Luftwaffe had dominated for years. By December 1943, the first P-51Bs were arriving in England. At first, they were few, a handful of squadrons under the 354th Fighter Group. But their debut missions over Bremen and Kiel stunned the bomber crews who saw them waiting above. The Mustang wasn't just another escort. It was the missing piece in a broken system. Within weeks, planning began for the unthinkable full-scale daylight raids on the German capital itself, escorted every mile of the way. The Luftwaffe didn't know it yet, but its long-held sanctuary was about to be shattered. The transformation of that idea, from concept to operational dominance, began in the cold winter of early 1944. In January 1944, the Allied air war shifted from survival to dominance. The Mustang was no longer an experiment, it was a strategic weapon. Every squadron that received it began to notice the same pattern. Range anxiety disappeared, and Luftwaffe ambushes lost their predictability. The Mustang's design was deceptively simple. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag, allowing it to fly faster and farther than anything in the sky. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built under license by Packard in the United States, could maintain high power at altitude, thanks to a two-stage supercharger. With two 75-gallon drop tanks under its wings, it could fly from England to Berlin, fight and return. A 1,650-mile round trip that rewrote every tactical assumption of the war. By February 1944, the 8th Air Force was reorganized under a new commander, Lieutenant General James H. Doolittle. His leadership marked a turning point, where his predecessor, Ira Eaker, had focused on tight bomber formations and limited fighter engagement. Doolittle reversed the philosophy entirely. Fighters were no longer to cling to the bombers. They were to hunt freely, destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground. It was an audacious change, and it came at exactly the right moment. The Germans were facing mounting pressure from all sides. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. The Allies were preparing for an invasion in the west. Yet the Reich's armament factories still functioned, fueled by forced labor and dispersed across central Germany. For the coming invasion to succeed, the skies over Europe had to be cleared. That mission fell to Doolittle's men and their new Mustangs. The first test came during Operation Argument, later known simply as Big Week. Between February 20 and 25, 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces struck aircraft assembly plants across Leipzig, Gotha, Regensburg, Augsburg, and Stuttgart. Thousands of bombers took off in coordinated waves, and for the first time their escort didn't turn back over the Rhine. The P-51s followed them all the way. For Luftwaffe command, the shock was immediate. Their interceptors scrambled as usual, from bases at Achmer, Venetian, and Parchim, expecting unprotected bombers. Instead, they found Mustangs waiting for them at altitude. Dogfights erupted over cities that had never seen American fighters before. The German pilots radioed reports of new enemy aircraft operating at impossible distances. By the third day, confusion turned to disbelief. Göring, informed of Mustangs over Regensburg and Eve, and Berlin, refused to believe it. He reportedly muttered to his staff, "If the Americans ever put fighters over Berlin, we lose the war." That day had come. Each Luftwaffe interception ended in heavy losses. The Americans, free from formation constraints, attacked in pairs and flights, diving through climbing German formations with superior energy and fire discipline. Bombers that had once been flying blind into slaughter now arrived home intact. For the first time, the strategic bombing campaign began to fulfill its intended purpose: systematic, sustained destruction of Germany's war industry. The statistics told the story. Between January and March 1944, American bomber losses dropped sharply, even as mission depth increased. German aircraft production peaked but could not compensate for the loss of trained pilots. The Luftwaffe's elite, men like Egon Meyer, Walter Osar, and later Gerhard Barkhorn, were fighting exhaustion as much as the enemy. Meanwhile, the Mustang's legend spread through bomber crews. The phrase "little friends" became a lifeline. When the sleek fighters appeared above formations, gunners cheered, survivability rates rose, morale, once fragile, hardened into quiet confidence. By early March, Doolittle approved what had been unthinkable only months before: a direct strike on Berlin itself. The target was not only strategic, it was psychological. To bomb the German capital in daylight, with full escort, would signal to every soldier, worker, and commander in the Reich that no place was safe. The operation required coordination across hundreds of aircraft, precise timing, and absolute belief in the Mustang's range. Fuel calculations were made to the last gallon. Pilots were briefed on emergency landing fields in Belgium and the North Sea. The margin for error was razor-thin, but confidence had replaced fear. The date was set March 6, 1944. At dawn, the airfields of East Anglia thundered to life. Engines warmed, frost burned off the wings, and formations assembled over the channel. It was the beginning of the mission that would shatter the illusion of German air superiority forever. And as the first waves crossed into enemy territory, the Luftwaffe began to scramble, unaware that this time the hunters were already waiting for them. That encounter, where disbelief met destruction, revealed the true power of the P-51 Mustang. The story of Berlin's first daylight defense against the P-51 Mustang can be understood through multiple lenses: tactical, technological, and psychological. Each angle exposes how one machine, properly employed, can rewrite the logic of a war. Until early 1944, American escort tactics were conservative. Fighters were ordered to remain close to the bomber boxes, defending against attacks rather than initiating them. This defensive posture handed initiative to the Luftwaffe, German pilots could climb, choose when to dive, and strike knowing their adversaries were tied to formation duty. Doolittle's arrival changed everything. He stripped the escort rulebook bare. Fighter groups would now go hunting. Instead of trailing the bombers, they would surge ahead, sweeping enemy airfields, intercepting climbing interceptors and cutting off attacks before they began. The P-51's speed and endurance made this doctrine possible. Its operational radius covered nearly every major Luftwaffe base in western and central Germany. Pilots could chase targets without the constant dread of fuel starvation that haunted P-47 and P-38 crews. This strategic freedom was decisive. Luftwaffe formations, built around timing their ascents to meet unescorted bombers, now found themselves ambushed mid-climb. Mustang squadrons, like the 4th and 357th Fighter Groups, would enter enemy airspace minutes ahead of the bombers, cruising high above at 30,000 feet. German radar operators reported fast single-engine aircraft deep in the Reich, a warning few commanders took seriously until it was too late. In combat, the results were brutal. The Luftwaffe's structure relied on coordination, ground control vectors, altitude advantage, and numerical concentration. The Mustang disrupted all of it. FW-190 formations, caught climbing, were slashed apart before reaching altitude. Fuel-laden Bf-109s were destroyed before firing a shot. The bomber losses that once reached double digits per mission began to fall sharply. For the first time, the air offensive's cost-benefit line tilted in favor of the Allies. Tactically, the P-51 was not merely an escort, it was a suppression weapon. It suppressed the Luftwaffe's ability to plan, to react, to fight on its own terms. The Mustang's power came from design principles that were years ahead of their time. The laminar flow wing, a near-miraculous innovation, kept airflow smooth, reducing drag and increasing efficiency at high speed. The fuselage was narrow but strong, its coolant system placed beneath to minimize frontal resistance. But its range was the true revolution. Before the P-51B entered service, no single-engine fighter in any air force could reach Berlin and return to base. Even twin-engine escorts like the P-38 struggled with fuel and altitude limitations. Engineers at North American and Rolls-Royce solved this problem through perfect synergy. The Packard-built Merlin 61 engine, paired with two-stage supercharging, allowed the Mustang to maintain 1,500 horsepower above 25,000 feet. Its specific fuel consumption, the amount burned per horsepower, was lower than any comparable engine in the war. Combined with 184 gallons internal fuel and two 75-gallon drop tanks, it achieved an unprecedented radius of 750 miles with combat allowance. For Luftwaffe intelligence officers, this was inconceivable. Even when wreckage of shot-down P-51s was recovered, many refused to believe a single-engine aircraft could travel that distance. German engineers estimated the Americans must be staging fighters from secret bases in Belgium or France. A theory that persisted until D-Day proved otherwise. The Mustang's performance also broke the myth of German technical superiority. Since 1939, the Luftwaffe had led the world in aircraft engineering. Its fighters, particularly the Bf-109 and FW-190, were masterpieces of their time. But by 1944, innovation in Germany had stagnated under bureaucracy, political interference, and production chaos. The Allies, by contrast, had achieved what the Reich could no longer sustain: precision manufacturing at industrial scale. Each Mustang that rolled off the line was identical in quality, tested and delivered with logistical consistency the Germans could not match. The result was a weapon that combined range, speed, and reliability, the holy trinity of aerial warfare. Every bomber crew that crossed the North Sea lived in the shadow of dread. The tension began at briefing. Crews memorized routes, altitudes, rally points. But when the map showed a red line stretching deep into central Germany, a quiet understanding passed through the room. Beyond the fighter range line, survival was luck. That invisible line haunted men for months. Crews counted down to the moment their escorts had to turn back. When the last P-47 rolled away, a silence settled inside the bomber. They knew what came next, black specks appearing ahead, diving head-on through flak bursts. The Mustang erased that silence. For the first time, those same crews looked up and saw silver wings above them, keeping pace all the way. The radio chatter changed tone. "Little friends are still with us." It was more than a phrase, it was oxygen. On the German side, the psychological effect was inverse. Goering's promise that no enemy fighter can reach Berlin collapsed overnight. The capital's defenders, once certain of home advantage, now faced enemies that appeared at their own airfields. Luftwaffe ground crews watched helplessly as Mustangs strafed parked aircraft, fuel trucks and runways. Fighter pilots began taking off. Under fire. The invincibility of the Reich's air arm fractured in days. Even Adolf Galland, the pragmatic general der Jagdflieger, understood the scale of the collapse. He admitted later, when the P-51 appeared over Berlin, "I knew the war was lost. The battle for the skies was no longer about skill. It was about reach." And on that cold morning in March 1944, the Americans proved they could reach anywhere. The story of the P-51 Mustang over Berlin is incomplete without examining the human, leadership, and enemy perspectives. Each reveals dimensions of warfare, often invisible in the statistics, yet decisive in shaping outcomes. For the men in the cockpit, every mission was a collision of endurance, skill, and terror. Mustang pilots flew at altitudes of 25,000 to 30,000 feet. Engines whining, oxygen masks in place, flak bursts tearing the sky below. Every engagement demanded split-second decisions: dive or climb, peel or attack, escort or chase. First wave of Mustang pilots arrived from the 4th, 52nd, and 357th Fighter Groups. Many were young, barely out of training, yet they faced veteran Luftwaffe pilots who had fought since 1939. They understood the risk. If they miscalculated fuel or altitude, they would die over Germany with no rescue. Bomber crews, long accustomed to hopelessness beyond fighter range, felt a mix of awe and relief. Accounts describe a near-religious response to the Mustang's presence. The sight of those silver fighters climbing to meet German interceptors restored confidence and focus. Mission success became tangible, not a hope against odds. The human cost, however, remained. Even with Mustangs, dogfights were deadly. Experienced German pilots could still inflict heavy losses. Radio chatter captured fear, aggression, and raw adrenaline. Bandits at 12 o'clock. "I'm hit, I'm going down." Crews counted friends and comrades with grim precision. Yet the psychological advantage shifted decisively. Where once bomber crews felt disposable, now they had agency. The presence of Mustangs allowed gunners to aim rather than despair, navigators to focus on course corrections rather than survival, and pilots to maintain formation integrity under pressure. This shift, subtle, intangible, human, amplified the Mustang's technical advantage. War is not just machines and fuel, it is men trusting machines enough to survive against impossible odds. The contrast between Allied and German command decisions crystallized the moment. Lieutenant General James H. Doolittle exemplified adaptive leadership. He trusted subordinate commanders, delegated tactical freedom, and enforced innovation. He discarded rigid doctrines that tethered fighters to bomber boxes, replacing them with fluid strategies that leveraged the Mustang's capabilities. He envisioned not merely bomber protection, but systemic destruction of the Luftwaffe's operational potential. Goering, in contrast, embodied rigidity. The Reichsmarschall clung to the assumption that geography, radar, and tradition guaranteed airspace safety. Even as reports of Mustangs over Leipzig and Berlin arrived, he dismissed them as misidentifications, believing the Allies could not solve the range problem. The human consequences of this leadership disparity were immediate. Luftwaffe wings were deployed piecemeal, out of phase and overextended. German pilots flew without cohesive doctrine, relying on instinct rather than strategy. Doolittle's Mustang squadrons exploited these gaps with precision. Leadership mattered more than ever. Tactical innovation allowed Americans to leverage technological superiority fully, while rigid German command ensured maximum exposure to loss. From the German perspective, early 1944 was a nightmare realized. Intelligence underestimated Allied capability. Radar could track formations but could not prevent their interception. The sudden appearance of Mustangs over central Germany was interpreted as an anomaly, a miscalculation in reporting, until B. Odys and wreckage proved otherwise. German fighter wings, Jagdgeschwader 26, JG-11, JG-54, were forced into defensive engagements they could not win. Even elite aces found themselves vulnerable. Bf-109s, nimble but lightly fueled, could not chase long-range Mustangs, and FW-190s, strong in firepower, were outmaneuvered at altitude. Morale deteriorated rapidly. Pilots whispered of a new breed of enemy aircraft, the ones that follow everywhere. Ground crews observed the destruction of parked aircraft, ammunition stores, and even airfield defenses. Operational capacity declined not from defeat in one engagement, but from cumulative erosion. The Luftwaffe faced a paradox. Maintaining air defense required sending pilots into battles where the odds were increasingly fatal. Every sortie risked losing irreplaceable veterans, further weakening the system. Within weeks, the psychological and operational damage was irreversible. The P-51's range allowed bombers to strike targets that were previously unreachable. Factories deep inside central Germany, previously insulated by geography and fuel constraints, were now vulnerable. Leipzig, Berlin, and Regensburg became accessible for sustained daylight raids. With Mustangs clearing skies, bombers could focus on production centers without constant disruption. Fighter sweeps suppressed Luftwaffe responses, reducing bomber losses dramatically. American intelligence reported that the Germans failed to repair or replace critical aircraft assembly machinery, while production planners calculated long-term recovery that would never materialize. The Mustang was more than a tactical asset. It was a force multiplier for strategic bombing. By reaching deep into the Reich, it changed the cost-benefit equation of Allied air operations. Every raid now contributed to both immediate destruction and long-term psychological pressure. By the first week of March 1944, the stage was set for the decisive confrontation over Berlin, a moment when all these angles converged: human, technological, tactical, and strategic. March 6, 1944. Dawn broke over the fields of East Anglia with a muted chill. Frost clung to the wings of assembled bombers. Engines rumbled, the metallic hum of hundreds of B-17s and B-24s filling the airfield. Pilots checked gauges and oxygen masks. Navigators confirmed headings. Berlin awaited. Lieutenant General James H. Doolittle stood on the tarmac, watching the formations taxi. For months he had planned this, the first full daylight strike on the German capital, escorted entirely by P-51 Mustangs. Every aircraft was calibrated for maximum range, every drop tank verified. The margin for error was non-existent. At 7:45, the lead formation lifted. Silver lines stretched across the sky, climbing toward altitude in disciplined waves. Behind them, the Mustangs ascended to 28,000 feet, their Merlin engines whining, ready to intercept any German fighter before it could reach the bombers. By 9:30, radar stations in Berlin picked up the approaching formations. Alarm sirens activated across the city. From Wernicken, JG-11 scrambled, FW-190s and Bf-109s racing toward the incoming threat. Intelligence officers reported that American bombers were far beyond their normal operational depth, and then the impossible single-engine fighters were visible among them, climbing higher, faster than any Luftwaffe commander had expected. The first contacts occurred over Brandenburg. German fighters reached the bomber stream only to find P-51s waiting. Dogfights erupted in spiraling clouds of smoke and contrails. Mustang squadrons, employing Doolittle's new free hunt doctrine, tore through the German formations. Bf-109s, exhausted from climbing, were outmaneuvered. FW-190s, designed for aggression at lower altitudes, struggled at 28,000 feet. Meanwhile, bombers pressed on. Gunners, once paralyzed by fear, now engaged with precision. The presence of the Mustangs transformed chaos into coordinated resistance. Every fighter lost by the Luftwaffe meant a clearer path to the Reich's capital. By 10:15, over the outskirts of Berlin, reports came in, 80 Luftwaffe fighters destroyed in a single day. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf pilots fell in waves. Fuel shortages, exhaustion, and superior American tactics compounded the disaster. Göring received fragmented updates, disbelief evident in his voice. German radar operators confirmed the impossible: American fighters operating deep in the heart of Germany. The sky over Berlin became a theater of relentless precision. Mustang pilots hunted in pairs, diving from 30,000 feet to intercept, then climbing back to high altitude to conserve energy. They circled formations of disoriented German fighters, striking again and again. Bomber crews watched, amazed. By 11:00, the bomber formations were over central Berlin. Explosions erupted from targeted factories. Smoke plumes climbed hundreds of feet, visible from the surrounding districts. The Luftwaffe could not mount a cohesive defense. Pilots were too few, too spread out and outclassed. From a tactical perspective, the day was unprecedented. German command had calculated losses in the tens. They faced 80 fighters destroyed, with dozens more damaged or forced to retreat. American bombers, protected by Mustangs for the first time over Berlin, suffered minimal casualties, a reversal of the deadly pattern that had dominated the previous year. The human cost for Luftwaffe pilots was catastrophic. Veterans with years of experience were lost in minutes. Replacement crews were inexperienced and ill-prepared for combat at this scale. Morale plummeted. The psychological shock was immediate. Berlin's defenders understood finally that the Reich's skies were no longer secure. For the Americans, the victory was both tangible and symbolic. Every bomber returned intact. Every Mustang that returned carried proof that strategic air power, combined with technological innovation and adaptive doctrine, could reach the enemy's capital unimpeded. The message was clear: no German city was safe, no Luftwaffe fighter untouchable. As the last bombers crossed back over the Elbe, the significance settled. The P-51 Mustang had not just escorted bombers, it had shattered a myth. German air defense, long considered invulnerable at depth, had been decisively broken. The stage was set for the full psychological and operational collapse of the Luftwaffe, a collapse that would unfold in the days and weeks following this unprecedented raid. March 6, 1944, progressed into midday over Berlin, and the airspace became a crucible of speed, fire, and metal. The Mustang squadrons had gained altitude advantage early, circling above the bomber stream, watching German fighters climb in futile pursuit. Energy tactics dictated every move: dive, fire, and climb. Exhaustion and fuel limitations crippled the Luftwaffe before they could reach optimal attack positions. By 12:00, reports confirmed the scale of destruction. 80 Luftwaffe fighters were lost in a single engagement. Bf-109s and Fw-190s scattered across forests, rivers, and open fields. Damage assessments would later show dozens more were crippled, forced to emergency landings or abandoned at forward airfields. For the first time, German air doctrine had failed in a decisive, measurable way. The psychological impact on German leadership was immediate. Göring's office received fragmented and contradictory reports from ground controllers and intelligence officers. Messerschmitt wings were missing, scattered, or unresponsive. Experienced pilots were dead, wounded, or grounded. The hubris that the Luftwaffe could defend the Reich's core had been shattered in a single, relentless morning. Meanwhile, Mustang pilots executed Doolittle's doctrine with ruthless efficiency. The free hunt allowed them to disengage from escort duty momentarily to pursue high-value targets. Several Mustangs strafed secondary German airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, damaging fuel depots, and demoralizing ground crews. Every tactical maneuver reinforced strategic superiority. At 13:30, bomber formations began their return flight. P-51s remained at altitude, ensuring that no stragglers were lost to desperate Luftwaffe attempts. The 8th Air Force could now demonstrate sustained bombing capability deep inside Germany without catastrophic attrition. The raid produced operational lessons that would shape the remainder of the European air war. First, technological advantage had to be fully exploited. The P-51's range and speed allowed strategic freedom previously unimaginable. Second, adaptive leadership was critical. Doolittle's willingness to abandon conventional escort doctrine maximized the Mustang's effectiveness. Third, morale and psychological dominance were now inseparable from tactical outcomes. American crews gained confidence, while the Luftwaffe faced disorientation and dread. The consequences for the Luftwaffe were immediate and systemic. Experienced pilots, the backbone of Germany's fighter capability, were irreplaceable. Losses on March 6 reduced operational squadrons to skeletal strength. Replacement pilots, often with minimal training, were sent into a battle they could not win. Fuel shortages, compounded by bombing of refineries and supply lines, prevented rapid recovery. The air arm's ability to contest future raids diminished sharply. Over Berlin, the smoke of bombed factories and strafed airfields rose into the thin March sky. Civilians looked up at the descending formations of Mustangs and bombers, a mixture of terror and helplessness gripping the city. German propaganda, previously asserting invulnerability, faltered. Newspapers would later attempt to spin the day as a minor setback, but Luftwaffe reports told the truth. The capital had been penetrated, and defended skies could not repel the attackers. By late afternoon, as the last bombers crossed the Elbe, operational control shifted irreversibly. The Reich's defenders were in retreat in the air. Commanders recalculated priorities, redirecting depleted squadrons to patch holes rather than aggressively engage. The momentum of the air campaign, previously in German hands, had definitively moved to the Allies. Doolittle's gamble had succeeded. Mustangs had turned the theoretical, the ability to escort bombers 150 miles, into the practical. The Luftwaffe's preconceptions of range, endurance, and defensive capacity were invalidated. For the first time in the European theatre, the combination of technological innovation, tactical flexibility, and operational scale had produced a blow that was both tangible and symbolic. The day closed with a stark contrast. The Americans counted victories, bombers intact, German fighters destroyed, and confidence restored. The Germans counted losses, pilots dead, fighters destroyed, and the psychological conviction that the Reich's skies were impregnable shattered. In these hours, the air war transformed. No longer could the Luftwaffe operate from Berlin with impunity. The P-51 Mustang had not merely escorted bombers, it had rewritten the calculus of strategic aerial warfare. Every subsequent mission would be influenced by the knowledge that American fighters could reach the Reich's heart and return unscathed. This decisive moment, 80 Luftwaffe fighters lost over Berlin, the full impact of long-range escort realized, set the stage for the Allied aftermath, where the consequences of this new aerial supremacy would ripple across strategy, production, and morale. The day after March 6, 1944, Berlin awoke to a reality that had been unthinkable just months earlier. Smoke from damaged factories still hung over the city, drifting across neighborhoods and industrial districts. German radar operators, pilots, and ground crews faced the undeniable truth. The Luftwaffe had failed to protect the capital. 80 fighters were gone. Dozens more were damaged. The Reich's defensive E-network had been exposed as brittle and overextended. Allied intelligence quickly assessed the operational impact. The loss of experienced Luftwaffe pilots could not be replaced immediately. The attrition was severe. Many of the men killed or captured had logged years of combat experience. Replacement programs, accelerated though they were, could not match the quality of veterans lost. Aircraft production, even at peak output, could not compensate for the depletion of trained airmen. Every sortie that followed carried the echoes of March 6, diminished crews facing technologically superior opponents, exhausted and demoralized. The Americans measured their own success not only by the numbers destroyed, but by the strategic shift it represented. The P-51 Mustang had changed the game. The bomber force, once shackled by range limitations, could now strike with impunity across the Reich. Factories, transportation hubs, and military installations that had seemed safe behind the perceived buffer of fighter range were now vulnerable. The psychological impact extended to every level of German command. Confidence in defensive doctrine eroded. Within the Luftwaffe, morale crumbled. Veteran commanders like Adolf Galland recognized the inevitability of Allied air supremacy. Training programs struggled to produce competent replacements, and every sortie became a confrontation between weary pilots and machines, superior in range, speed, and altitude capability. Luftwaffe leadership faced a grim calculus: send undertrained pilots to intercept and risk annihilation, or preserve remaining assets and concede air dominance. Both options carried catastrophic consequences. In Washington and London, planners analyzed the data and realized the implications for the wider war effort. The P-51 had not only increased survivability, but created the potential for sustained, uninterrupted daylight raids on German industry. Strategic bombing could now systematically degrade production, morale, and infrastructure without prohibitive loss rates. Air superiority over Germany was no longer theoretical, it had been operationally realized. Beyond immediate military calculations, March 6 left an indelible mark on perception. German leadership, previously confident in homeland defense, now confronted the reality that no city was truly safe from American long-range escort fighters. Civilians, reading propaganda and hearing rumors, began to question assurances of invulnerability. The collapse of the Luftwaffe's defensive capacity was visible not only in numbers, but in the collective consciousness of a nation that had long believed the Reich's skies untouchable. The operational lessons were clear. Escort fighters must exploit their full range, aggressive tactics yield decisive results, and technological advantages can redefine entire campaigns. For the Allies, March 6 validated months of experimentation and planning. For the Germans, it marked the beginning of a period of irreversible disadvantage in the air war. The groundwork for subsequent operations was laid. Berlin and other key industrial centers were no longer safe havens. American bomber formations, reinforced by the Mustang's reach, could plan raids deep into Germany with confidence, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape. Every calculation from sortie planning to aircraft production now assumed Allied air dominance. The shockwaves of March 6 reverberated immediately, shaping both operational decisions and strategic doctrines, setting the stage for the continued erosion of the Luftwaffe and the unchallenged advance of Allied air power. By late March 1944, the consequences of the Mustang's reach and the Berlin raid were tangible across the Luftwaffe's structure. Fighter wings were thinned, often reduced to skeleton strength. Experienced pilots, once the backbone of German aerial defense, were irretrievably lost. Replacement pilots, frequently rushed through abbreviated training programs, could not repel. Placate the tactical instincts, marksmanship, or situational awareness of veterans. Operational effectiveness plummeted. Fuel shortages exacerbated the problem. Allied bombing had begun to strike refineries and supply lines. Even when aircraft remained airworthy, pilots found themselves grounded or forced into emergency landings. The Luftwaffe's ability to coordinate effective defensive sorties was no longer merely compromised, it was effectively paralyzed in sectors where Mustangs operated freely. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate sorties. Aircraft production, though continuing at a steady pace, could not compensate for the attrition of trained personnel. The Reich's industrial infrastructure was now vulnerable not only to bombs but to the systemic pressure of attrition. The psychological toll of these losses created hesitation among commanders. They began deploying fighters conservatively, prioritizing survival over interception. This hesitation allowed subsequent Allied missions deeper penetration with reduced losses. Casualty reports from the March 6 engagement highlighted the scale of the collapse. Units such as JG-26 and JG-11, previously elite, recorded unprecedented fatality rates. Surviving pilots reported severe disorientation during engagements, describing American formations as everywhere at once. Luftwaffe communications became fragmented, coordination between ground control and fighter units broke down under the relentless pressure of Mustang-equipped missions. Allied analysis showed the day's raid as a tipping point in the air campaign. Whereas prior losses had constrained bombing raids, the P-51's operational range allowed full escort to Berlin and beyond. Subsequent missions capitalized on this advantage, steadily degrading German air capacity while maintaining manageable bomber losses. Strategic bombing effectiveness increased, contributing directly to the crippling of German aircraft production, transportation networks, and ultimately, military mobility. The human cost extended beyond the Luftwaffe. Civilians experienced the tangible reality of vulnerability. Reports of bombs striking factories and industrial districts fed public anxiety. Propaganda, previously confident in the inviolability of the Reich's skies, struggled to maintain credibility. Berlin, once considered secure, had been breached in full daylight. The event undermined the Reich's narrative of invincibility, creating a psychological ripple that extended through military, industrial, and civilian sectors alike. The operational lessons were codified quickly. Escort doctrine evolved. Long-range fighters would remain with bombers through the entirety of deep penetration missions. Aggressive engagement strategies were reinforced, with emphasis on denying the Luftwaffe freedom to maneuver. Mustangs became the vanguard of a new phase in the air war, one in which the Allies controlled both space and initiative. By the end of March 1944, the cumulative effect was undeniable. German air defenses were depleted, exhausted, and demoralized. The concept of home airspace invulnerability no longer applied. Allied air power, once constrained by fuel, altitude, and range limitations, now operated with unprecedented freedom. The Mustang had not simply escorted bombers, it had created operational dominance that would shape every subsequent engagement over Germany. Statistical evidence reflected the shift. Luftwaffe sortie numbers dropped despite increased urgency. Replacement pilots faced abnormally high casualty rates. Production centers targeted in raids continued to operate below optimal capacity. The combination of human loss, technological disadvantage, and operational paralysis signaled that the balance of air power had irrevocably shifted. March 6, 1944, was not an isolated victory. It was the turning point where the Luftwaffe's dominance ended, where the psychological and operational foundations of German air power cracked. And the P-51 Mustang demonstrated that range, technology, and doctrine together could decisively alter the trajectory of the war. March 6, 1944, stands as a turning point not just in the air war over Europe, but in the understanding of what technological advantage, combined with strategic vision, can achieve. The P-51 Mustang, once a concept on a drawing board in Inglewood, California, had transformed from a fighter aircraft into a decisive instrument of war. Its range, speed, and reliability redefined the operational possibilities of the Allied air campaign. The human dimension of that day is inseparable from the machine itself. Bomber crews, long accustomed to inevitable attrition, experienced relief and renewed purpose. Mustang pilots, tasked with unprecedented freedom, faced danger with skill and discipline, their actions altering the calculus of life and death over Germany. The Luftwaffe, confronted by a capability it could neither match nor anticipate, collapsed under the dual pressure of technological inferiority and operational shock. Strategically, the consequences were profound. Berlin, the industrial heart of the Reich, had been exposed. German air doctrine, long reliant on the assumption of inviolable home airspace, was proven flawed. The psychological and operational ramifications rippled across the Reich. Hesitation replaced decisiveness, caution replaced initiative, and fear replaced confidence. The Allies had gained more than the ability to destroy factories. They had seized control of the air, shaping the tempo of the war itself. In retrospect, March 6 illustrates the intersection of technology, leadership, and doctrine. Doolittle's willingness to rethink escort strategy, combined with the Mustang's unprecedented capabilities, created a moment where history could pivot. It demonstrates that warfare is not static, that supremacy is always contingent upon adaptation and foresight, and that human skill amplifies the potential of engineering innovation. The P-51 Mustang's achievement over Berlin was more than a tactical success. It symbolized the dawn of operational air dominance, the moment when the Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility shattered and the trajectory of the European conflict shifted irreversibly. It was a demonstration of endurance, precision, and foresight, a testament to what occurs when technology and strategy converge in the unforgiving skies of war. This day, and the aircraft that made it possible, reshaped the war in the air, and with it the course of history,